Just over 3 years ago, the Gulf War ended when Operation Desert Storm came to a successful conclusion, pushing Saddam Hussein's troops out of Kuwait. But for some, that meant the fight was just beginning. They were the brave firefighters called in to put out the fires that were raging in Kuwait's oil fields. One of them was Suffolk resident Peter Allen, who joins me now. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, Rachel.
How on earth did you get involved in something like this?
Well, it goes back a lot of years with working with different oil well fire situations, blowouts, and our company worked fairly closely with the Red Adair Group over the period of years and around the world. Excuse me. And we had anticipated when the troops finally got a ceasefire that we would be going in, and we were called in by the Kuwait Oil Group, and we landed there with a small team to run an assessment of the damage and the facilities which were still operable and equipment which was still available, which, as it turned out, there wasn't too much left to work with.
So what was the scene that greeted you when you arrived in Kuwait?
Well, we flew in with a Learjet, and at 7,000 feet we ran into the smog, and that was the top of the cloud cover with all the smoke from the fires, and we worried our way down into a landing pattern set up by the Americans, and they had one runway cleared where we could come in, and we landed, and it was just total devastation. It was just like flying into literally a war zone, and we caught a ride in an army truck to the KOC camp, where they were set up a minimum group of people and a base camp for firefighters to come in and try and organize a work program.
How many fires were you facing?
There was, I think the total count was over 650 wells on fire.
650? I mean, where do you begin to start?
That's what we said. It was pretty difficult because the big problem was the live ordnance left laying around. A lot of mines and booby traps, and you never knew where you were with it, because some of the wells were not on fire and they were spewing oil, which then saturated the desert, and that blanked out all the tracks and roadways. You could never tell if it was safe to drive there or not. So they did move into groups of ordnance people to start clearing these roads and making the well sites as safe as possible for what they could see and what they could find. And then we just started working our way through with different teams and bring the wells under control.
What was it like? I mean, you've fought oil fires before, but accidental fires. What was it like to know that this had all been done deliberately?
It's pretty devastating. When you can never imagine 2 million barrels of oil a day burning, and that was the situation we had there.
Did you ever think that you would just never be able to get this under control?
Well, we wondered that. The estimates initially when we first got there was 3 years, but as it turned out, they were brought under control within 1 year, which is quite an accomplishment. But once we got into the actual killing and controlling the wells, there was a pattern developed with different applications, and it became a lot quicker than we had initially anticipated.
How many people were there in the firefighting teams?
Oh, there was 4 major companies, and then there's a lot of other support companies working with the American firefighters. And total people involved would probably be over 400 or 500 people with the whole teams. There's a lot of support teams connected with the oil well fires and the control systems, hauling water and running cats and bulldozers and moving debris and trucking. And
what was the reaction of the local people when you arrived?
Well, there weren't too many local people left. They had all moved out to Saudi and into Qatar and Dubai. But the ones that had stayed they'd had a pretty rough time. The Iraqis didn't leave much. What they couldn't carry away, they trashed. And the city itself was really devastated. A lot of buildings were never really destroyed as such, but there was nothing left. Everything was robbed.
You brought along to show me today, and it's a shame we can't show them to the listeners, bearing in mind it's radio, but you show me some photographs of the sort of situations, and obviously there's the tragic photographs of the bombed buildings and vehicles, there's bodies and so on. There's also other things that strike me. We heard about this awful cloud that was over everywhere, the smoke. You've got some photographs that you've taken 11 o'clock in the morning, and it's so dark you can't see your hand in front of you on these pictures. That must have created a tremendous problem if you were trying to work in those sort of conditions.
That was one of the biggest hazards, Rachel, was getting out into the field working. And with a wind change, the smog would move around and shift across the road, and you couldn't see to drive. So we had quite a worry. We just worked what we call daylight hours, if you can call it daylight. Some days it was so bad we couldn't work at all in the field. And communication was fairly tough. We didn't have a lot of communication equipment initially. So everybody had to be very, very careful and alert and try to and stay safe. That was the main thing, was the safety aspect.
How dangerous was it?
Pretty dangerous. We lost some people in there through the smog and running off the road into burning wells, and it was pretty bad.
If you can try and sort of make us visualise the scene. You're driving along, you can't find the road, there's these rivers of oil everywhere, you're splodging your way through that. It's pitch black because of the sky, the smoke above you, the fumes. The smell must have been awful as well. As you approach an oil rig on fire, how near can you get? What's it like?
It's like driving into Dante's Inferno, if you can imagine that. It's pretty hair-raising. But the most fires are pretty hairy to work around. But with all the ordnance laying around, that was the biggest worry with not knowing if it was safe to drive, mines and so on and so forth. Until they got that partially cleared, where we could start a program of working our way down through the fields, and then everybody felt quite a bit more comfortable with the operation. But initially, it was pretty bad.
How do you actually put out an oil rig fire? How do you start?
Well, there's many methods, Rachel. Most of these wells were blown up with the wellheads were sheared off at ground level, so that left an integral part of the wellhead structure, the system, the Christmas tree as we call it, where you could tie in and pump in fluid, weighted mud, which would then overcome the well pressure and bring it under control. And some proved more difficult than others. There was a lot of different methods tried. We tried snuffing them out with nitrogen, it did work partially, but it wasn't a good continuous procedure. We scrubbed that idea eventually. The biggest problem we had initially was getting sufficient water into the field to cool down the area around the wellhead and all the ground fires that were burning. So what they did, they turned the production lines around and put pumps down on the beach, and then pumped seawater inland. And we dug lagoons and lined them with plastic, and that was the reservoir for each kill procedure, where you could get lots of water sprayed onto the wellhead, sprayed onto the ground, cool things down. The biggest danger with an oil well fire is reignition after you get it out. That's where it gets really dangerous. That's where you have to be very, very careful.
We're used to seeing the pictures of Red Adair in his red overalls and so on, the red helmet. What sort of clothes did you have to wear to protect you from these dangers?
We all used on this particular project, we used these Nomex coveralls, which are fire resistant, and that was a big asset. But really you didn't have any real protection as such. You just worked within the limitation of the heat you could stand, and of course the firefighters were in there fairly close, but again the cooling down with the water was a big asset, because that cuts the heat and you can get in closer and work where you have to work.
Do you have to be a sort of fairly philosophical sort of person? If this is going to be your day to go, it's going to be your day to go no matter what you do.
Well, I remember a big fire we were fighting in northern Canada many years ago with Red, and we were laying out there on a fairly potential situation where we could have got in trouble with it. Was an H2S well was on fire. This hydrogen sulfide gas, which is one of the worst conditions you can work under. And we were laying out there behind a shield with a 45-gallon empty drum, filling it full of dynamite. And I remember Adair looking at me and he said, "Alan, if this ever goes off, we'll never know about it."
If you're going to go, you're going to go quickly
go
anyway.
Quickly.
Yes,
but he was a great guy to work with, and I've worked with him pretty much all over the world the last 40 years. In fact, I worked with the old original firefighter in Canada. Before it was Red Adair, was Marion Kinley. Came up to Canada with Red Adair and Boots Hanson. And we fought a well there for Imperial Oil, just south of Edmonton.
He's the sort of person that's entered the legends, hasn't he? I mean, we build up this image of Red Adair, and there's been films made about his life and so on. Is he just a symbol of the whole industry, or is he really that special as a man himself?
He's pretty special, Rachel.
Why? In what way?
Well, he got in with McKinley at the start, and then he built his team and the expertise that he had. He worked for the underwater demolition U.S. Navy. That's where he got a lot of his explosive information and training from. And he put together a competent team, and he's never killed a man, which you can't say for a lot of the other firefighting companies. He's just a big old Texas boy, and he's just rough and tumble, but he's a super chap. You can work with him, he's careful, and he knows his business. And he runs the show. When he's on location, it's his program. He's the man.
Now, when you were in Kuwait, what were the living conditions like when you got away from this heat, dirt, dust?
Well, you're never really away from it because there was the buildings were just open. Some of the doors had been blown off. We just had to prop them up, and it was first couple of weeks. It was pretty miserable. We had very little water. Food was flown in, of course, and it was cold. Believe it or not, Kuwait can get pretty cold in March, April.
I hadn't realised that. I thought it would be hot and horrible.
No, daytime it was, but it cools down pretty rapidly at night. And we spent half the evening running around trying to steal blankets to keep warm.
Now, how did your Kuwait experience compare with other fires that you've been involved in? You mentioned one in Canada. I mean, was it that different?
Well, it was such a vast operation that there was so much going on and so many people involved. It was quite complex to supervise and make sure you had so many people working in different areas to keep everybody safe and knew what was going on and keep the contact and communication open. I think it was the biggest challenge we ever run into.
Or hopefully will ever do again.
Right.
It was achieved in a year instead of 3 years, you said.
Correct.
So at the end, when it all finished, how did you feel then?
Well, I wasn't there on the final stages, but I think there was a lot of relief from everybody that we came through safely. That was a big factor, and got the job done and got things back. At least got the oil fields closed in where we could start repairing the wellheads and getting the production back online.
When you watch the news bulletins now and you hear about the situation and Saddam Hussein and so on, do you ever fear that you might have to go back and do the job again, or your colleagues might?
I think he's still potentially dangerous. I wouldn't trust that group at all, personally, but I hope not. But I think we have a better control over the situation now.
You're fairly optimistic for the future?
I think so. I think Kuwait the borders are still a big bone of contention. But that'll go on for some years. But until they get it really defined and things settle down, it won't change.
Now, Peter, you're from Orford originally. You've now retired and moved back to Orford. It's a lovely place to live, but how on earth does it compare with the sort of experiences you've had in the past? I mean, what are you going to do with your life now?
It's pretty quiet out there. I'm still traveling quite a bit and still connected with the marine operation, which I was responsible for many years in Dubai, the offshore to the oil industry. And I'm still doing a few projects in that vein. And also, I've just recently bought a yacht. I'm going to do some sailing and spend more time with the family, which I didn't spend a lot of time over the years. My daughter's going to school in Felixstowe College, and I think Rebecca's ready to spend some more time with Dad, and I'm happy with that.
I bet they're glad to have you safely back in Suffolk.
It was a worry. For everybody connected, it was a worry. Because, you know, every day was one day at a time, you might say. And the conditions were rough, and there was a lot of good people made a real effort to bring that thing under control.
Are you glad you were there?
Yeah, it was a challenge I wouldn't have missed.
The high point of a career, would you say?
I'd say so, yes.
Well, thank you very much indeed for coming in today and reliving some of it with us. We hope you have a long, peaceful and happy retirement in Orford, and thanks for coming in today.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Peter Allen, who lives in Suffolk now but who helped to put out the fires in Kuwait just about 3 years ago to the day. Pretty close anyway. Thank you.